The woke left tried their very hardest to ruin and to cancel Canada Day this year. Let's not let them ruin Remembrance Day too. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. Hi, thank you so much for tuning into the program. It's great to have you with us. Now, if you have been following the news, if you've been following our reports at True North, you know about the controversy when it comes to the flag. The flag was lowered to be taken down to half-mast at the end of May. So we're talking about 6 months ago. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, said, let's lower the flags in commemoration. At the time, we just learned about an apparent discovery of unmarked graves at a residential school near Kamloops, British Columbia. So the band leader came out, said that they had evidence and proof of unmarked graves of children who had attended the residential schools. As you know, it created an incredible media backlash. Several other bands came forward with their own claims of unmarked graves, and basically the country went into mourning. There was this great shame cast over all Canadians, and these really, really wild accusations that say that basically Canada committed genocide. Canada was a genocidal state, that the residential schools were not aimed at with the intention of educating people and lifting them out of poverty, but the intention of those residential schools was simply to kill everybody. That's basically the accusation that has been leveled against Canada by the woke left. And Justin Trudeau just sort of shrugged and said, let's just lower these flags down to half-mast. This is totally unprecedented for the flags to be lowered down in commemoration of a historical event, and also to remain lowered for this long. So more and more people were calling for those flags to go up. They finally did go up, mostly just so that they could go down again on Remembrance Day. And so I think that's at least a good sign. Okay, we're coming together as a country. We're saying, look, some really bad things happened in the past. The residential schools were a horrible abuse of power and a terrible program that has gone wrong, that went wrong. I don't defend it in any way. However, I don't think that the intent of it was to kill people. I think the intent of it was good. They wanted to educate people. Unfortunately, this one-size-fits-all policy where they took children out of their homes and forced them into residential school, bad idea. Lots of bad things happened. Lots of bad outcomes. Okay, so because of the sort of discovery and this sort of public awakening that we've had when it comes to the woke left demanding that every Canadian concede to this point that we committed genocide, that Canadians are genocidal, that our country is built on this horrible legacy, that we're all white supremacists, that we have to decolonize our country, that they did their best to try to ruin our country's national holiday on Canada Day. As you recall, there were huge efforts to cancel Canada Day, and it worked. Some politicians were just so afraid to speak back against the mob, to tell them what they're saying is wrong, that they allowed it. They canceled their own ceremonies, that they tried to equate all of Canada's history to this one program that was a failed program, and because of it, we just didn't get to do Canada Day in the same way. I mean, let me just say that most Canadians ignored that. Most Canadians still went out and enjoyed their freedom and celebrated with fireworks and with friends and drinks and all the things that we love to do on July 1st, on Dominion Day or Canada Day. But there was that movement, and there was sort of an ugly shadow that was looming over us all during Canada Day. Well, we sort of have the same moment now with Remembrance Day, where for some reason, instead of the whole country coming together to honor the good parts of our history, to honor the people who sacrificed for our freedom, some of the great accomplishments that Canada has had on a military front to keep the entire world safe, instead of talking about that, the same shame is sort of looming over us once again. The same woke forces are trying to cancel Canada Day. And so I wanted to bring on a guest today on the program to help us understand this phenomenon and really how we can push back and fight against it. So I am joined by Mark Milke. Dr. Mark Milke is a public policy analyst, keynote speaker, author, columnist, and an author of 6 books. His most recent book is called The Victim Cult. I really recommend you check it out. It is excellent. So Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Candice.
Well, so Mark, it's Remembrance Day. This is a time where Canadians usually reflect upon our history, where we honor those who have sacrificed for our country. But then there is this sort of looming, guilt that Canadians are meant to feel about some of the revelations about our history, some of the darker moments of our history. So let me ask you this: you're a historian. You're very well versed in Canadian history. Do you think Canadians have reason to be proud? And how can we push back against some of the naysayers who say that we should just sort of feel this eternal guilt about being Canadian?
Yeah, absolutely. We should feel proud. And I think the core problem in what you're seeing today, this notion that we can't celebrate Canada, is actually utopian. I mean, I wrote about this in the victim cult, but if you look at the past, or the last century rather, the ideologues and the utopians were at least looking forward, right? I mean, the Marxists were dead wrong in economics, but they thought they could create this new perfect world in the future. And now we're beset by ideologues and utopians who look past to the past and wonder why it wasn't perfect. Well, because you live in an imperfect planet with imperfect people. So the notion that we can't celebrate Canada is compared to what? Compared to a utopia of one's imagination of the past or the present or the future, or who? First Nations in Canada, who, let me be blunt. I mean, look, everyone should be remembered fondly for their service to Canada, their contribution to Canada on this day. But there is really no people group in the history of the planet, for the most part, that wasn't involved in, for example, slavery, including in British Columbia and including before, what people like to call settlers. Most of us, most of our ancestors came. So there's no perfect history, and that's part of the problem today. Is people somehow weirdly expect that history and those in it should have been perfect.
Right. Well, there's this weird, we're in this weird moment, Mark, where we're supposed to really carefully reflect upon, Canadian history and all of the wrongs that have been done by Canadians. But to your point, the history of the sort of pre-European history in North America is really largely undiscussed and undiscovered. I remember you wrote an interesting piece not too long ago, I think it was in the Orca, where you talked about how prior to Europeans, the idea that First Nations were peaceful and loving is totally wrong, that they were quite cruel and barbaric in some ways. Like you mentioned, the history of slavery is really something that people don't know much about. What I've noticed recently is that we can't even really discuss the history of migration when it comes to First Nations people, because when I was in school, we were taught that people came across the Bering Land Bridge. Maybe it was prior to an ice age, but still, maybe thousands of years ago, maybe more than that, maybe less than that. But it seems now that there's this weird notion where that none of this history is even discussed. It's like politically incorrect or something. So why is it that some history is so important to dissect and look through and revisit, whereas other history is completely brushed over and forgotten?
Well, history has become politicized. So whenever politics gets into history, it's no longer honest history. And I think it's become, a weapon. It's been weaponized from some ideologues. Look, if I came from a culture that had been recently abused, or my ancestors have been abused, and again, everyone's has, if you go back far enough, I'd probably be sensitive as well to criticism of, say, my culture. But I think the problem is no one owns the past, no one owns history, no one owns even one's own ethnicity or culture. What happened happens. The question is, how do you get to a better spot today? Which is, where I like to go. But I think you also have to start in honesty in the past. So yes, I think obviously, if I was an Indigenous Canadian, I'd be pretty upset that the vote was removed and wasn't restored until 1960. But I think part of what we're facing today is this weird dynamic where social media can amplify a past tragedy. And there are all sorts of past tragedies that can be amplified. But if you think pre-social media, let's go back to the 1970s. I don't know if you were around, but I was a kid. But or the 1980s or even the early 1990s, really before the internet took off, you would have to have, say, major newspapers or news hour broadcasts at 6 p.m., say in the United States, the big three, pound on a story again and again and again to make it, really, give it life day after day, like the Watergate hearings, right? Because there was something new every day. Weirdly, now that with social media, that we can extract an event out of the past, and again, there's no shortage of tragedies, and say, well, this is the reason I am the way I am today, or my group is the way I am today. That's actually really dangerous. It's a false cause and effect link. But I think there's some of that happening today as well. I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I mean, that's part of the dynamic I think that we're seeing, and we have to think carefully about really dragging the past out to beat up the present.
Right, and to the point that you make in the victim cult is that it's not helpful. I mean, to people who come from a group that has been marginalized or that have been victimized, it's good to acknowledge that, but does it really help them move on. You know, thinking of some of these new concepts, these new woke concepts that we hear about, like white privilege, the sort of idea that is undergrained is that white people have more power, and that's a very dangerous message to be putting out in society, because it can give people of all different backgrounds a really bad idea of what the real world is. You know, if you're not white, you might think, oh, no matter how hard I try, I'm never going to succeed. And if you are white, you might think, oh, I'm going to coast through life and everything's going to be easy for me. And both of those things are obviously wrong. And so a part of it is like, how do we come together as a country and make sure that there is equal opportunity and that all people are treated fairly now, and make sure that people who are still in poverty, people who live in some of these really remote reserves, have the opportunities that they should have in a country like Canada. Mark, how do we make our country better amidst this whole sort of woke left guilt trip that we're in the middle of?
Well, I think you're onto something, and what you mentioned earlier about remembering history. So again, I'm fully in favor of remembering history. You know, all of it: the bad, the good, the warts, the ugly. But I think part of it is, again, reminding people that, first of all, no one's ancestors are pure. You go back far enough, and everybody's got a black sheep in the family, their ancestral or ethnic or national tree. But also, remembering the good parts of history. Like, it's not as black and white as people think. One of the articles, I think you referenced it a moment ago, that I wrote a few months ago in the Orca, was about British Columbia's history, and I came across this book about the history of Black Canadians, written in the early 1970s, and it had some real gems. It actually talked about, for example, there was a migration in the late 1850s, early 1960s, of hundreds of Black Californians to Victoria, and they were actually warmly accepted by the local Anglican Church, by the local governor at the time. I think it was James Douglas. And they wrote back to their, to other, friends and relatives in California, saying what a wonderful place Victoria was. And of course, like everybody who moves to Victoria, even then bragged about the gardens, or, the pleasant, climate and the rest of it. But this was 1860. And oddly enough, or ironically enough, the intolerance towards some Black immigrants to Canada in Victoria came a little bit later, when there was more American immigration from California and elsewhere of whites. Because there was, they're in the middle of the Civil War, or about to enter it, or exiting it, depending on the period you're talking about. But Anglican Canadians in, the British Empire in early 1860s, they were welcoming to Blacks. And in fact, they were encouraged to run for office. They were given citizenship. I think it was after 9 months or something like that, or certainly allowed to run for office even after 9 months. And so, there's no perfect history, and there's, black spots on the history of Canada for sure. But I think part of combating the nonsense today is to kind of virtually shake people a little bit and say, again, you're kind of missing the point if you think this group, has some sort of moral advantage over this group. As you know, from the victim cult, I quoted Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famous Soviet dissident, and he talks about how it's common for people to say, if only you are removed from this situation, or, taken out, in communist, dictatorships of his era, if only we remove this person, life will be better. And we see that person as evil. And what he said was, no, the line between good and evil runs between, is in each human heart. It's in each one of us, that line, that dividing line. And so it's actually hubris for anyone to suggest that, again, we can't celebrate Canada because someone in 1867, a 19th century imperialist, was a 19th century imperialist. Well, I would hope we could take stuff from First Nations history and celebrate it, regardless of the fact that, yes, First Nations practiced slavery in British Columbia when the British tried to stamp it out, including James Douglas, who in one case bought a slave to free that slave in around 1850, and tried to wipe out slavery in British Columbia during his tenure, and it wasn't exactly successful. It lasted until the late 1890s in British Columbia because the region was so remote at that time. So long answer to short question. I think telling the truth about history, in other words, getting people to think a little more modestly about everyone's history, might be part of the remedy.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, and again, something that we don't often hear about. We often hear about how the British had slaves, held slaves, or the Americans held slaves. We don't often hear about how it was the British and then the Americans who were the earliest people in the world to stop slavery and to fight against those who continued to carry slaves. I totally agree with your point, Mark, that we need to do more to celebrate First Nations people and history and their contributions. One of the things that happened this year is that there was a second sort of Veterans Day, First Nations Veterans Day, or I think it's called Indigenous Veterans Day, that fell a couple days before Remembrance Day. And for me, I would prefer that we celebrate all together. We're all one country. Our contributions came together, whether it was in the First World War, Second World War, Korea, Afghanistan, wherever it was, we were fighting together. But to your point, perhaps having a second dedicated day to First Nations contributions might help Canadians learn more of those stories. What's your take on that? Do you think it's a good idea to have these two separate days?
But I don't like separate ceremonies. The acerbic comedian, American comedian Bill Maher, has ripped a strip off of colleges and universities in the United States and have separate Black graduation ceremonies. Because I mean, really he said, welcome back to separate but equal, right? And I think it's the same danger here. Add to history, let's help people remember it. I mean, I just wrote a column for the Calgary Herald on Winston Churchill, remembering Winston Churchill properly. And the co-author was Kelvin Van Esch, who's half Mohawk. His father's Mohawk, his mother's Dutch German. And he hates identity politics because, as he told me in a personal call, and I don't think he minds, me saying this. I mean, what's he supposed to do? Look down on his mother because she's white? So this is a really dangerous precedent. We have separate this, separate that. I mean, the ideal of liberal democracy isn't bad. It is that you look at people as individuals only in law and policy. And it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, rich, poor, your background, your ethnicity, your nationality, what happened to your ancestors, what your ancestors did to my ancestors. When you get before a court of law, when you apply for a government program, when you're in the unemployment line or whatever it is, you're treated as an individual. And unfortunately, we're going away from that focus on the individual to, again, celebrating us because of whatever. The danger in that, Candice, is none of us can change our skin color. None of us can change, much else about how we were born or our history. And I think it's, people often make the same mistake in history and repeat the same evil, and sometimes from the best of intentions. So they think, well, to make up for past wrongs, we need to kind of discriminate against someone now. I mean, think about the illogic of that. So let's suppose you're, I don't know, the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, and somehow because you got the wrong skin color in an application for employment today to the federal government, because you're not the right color or ethnicity, you may lose out the job. I mean, to even discuss it, to even have that, I think is so offensive to the notion of treating individuals as individuals. And that's the danger, is we're trying to correct the past, in quotes, by making up for it in the present, and you can't. Now, look, there's some, if you step on my toe, Candice, and, or hit me, your car drives into mine and it's your fault. Well, you're on the hook for repairing my car, I don't know, my medical bill for my foot, if this wasn't Canada and it wasn't public health care. But beyond like pretty clear cause and effect links, the Japanese, their property is confiscated. We owed them after that confiscation in the 1950s for what we did in the 1940s, or what Canada did. But beyond clear cause and effect links and recent cause and effect links, it's really dangerous to go down this road of your group was, unkind to my group, and we're going to now punish your group in the present, as if anybody alive today had anything to do with slavery, abolished in the United States in 1865, or practically abolished in Canada in 1820, and in the entire British Empire by 1833, in fact. So it's a very dangerous road we're going down. So again, I think it's helpful to remember that you want to help people as individuals. If you're poor, we have a government program to help you out, that sort of thing. But to stay away from identity politics. Again, my friend Kelvin, who wrote this op-ed about, Indigenous soldiers, by the way, we added that to the column. 3 Indigenous soldiers that deserve celebration. That's the way to do it. You celebrate together. And we've come a long way to try and get to that point. And it's really moving backwards to have separateness in any form or fashion.
Well, that's very well put, and I appreciate it. Just final question for you, Mark. It's Remembrance Day. Is there any one specific moment in history or any one story that you like to reflect on, you like to think about on Remembrance Day? You just mentioned a column that you wrote about some First Nations moments, so maybe you can share one of those with us.
Well, sure. And, one of the soldiers, so we had three names in the column, and it's not in front of me, but one was an Indigenous soldier born in Saskatchewan, was the first Edmonton police officer of First Nations ancestry, and later went off to fight in the First World War, and was a runner. In fact, he was also the first Indigenous person in Canada to compete in the Olympics. Ended up being a runner because of his physical prowess in World War I. Tragically died in 1917. But that's the kind of thing we can celebrate and point to, and we should. So that's what we did in our column. And if you look up the column at either markmilke.com or the Calgary Herald, and look for Mark Milke and Kelvin Van Esch, you'll see the column there about the Indigenous service in our nation's history.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, I encourage everyone to go out and do that. And thank you, Mark, for joining us on Remembrance Day. Hope you have a wonderful day reflecting and doing whatever you do on Remembrance Day. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Candice.
All right. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.